years ago. There was one journal, and if you said you were interested in disasters, you were an academic studying them, people thought you were frankly weird. Now it's interesting to find that now there are tens of thousands of people studying disasters, and there are about 85 journals and a further 530 that occasionally publish papers on it. So the field has not so much grown but exploded. So the question really then is, why hasn't the problem of disasters been shelved, conquered, solved, done away with? And I think there are many reasons for that, including the complexity and the dynamism of society and the way that things change. It's always heartening to see something like these 2 days when two countries with similar hazard and disaster impact profiles have come together to share their expertise. The two countries probably that have the worst tsunami hazard of just about anywhere, and have therefore begun to develop the very best tsunami expertise of just about anywhere. So it is very heartening to see them come together and share that expertise, and we have great hopes from that process in the future. And the variety of different talks that have taken place illustrate the sheer complexity of the problem because of the very many aspects covered. And that, of course, is destined to get, if anything, more complex because of the sort of society that we live in. I believe strongly that large disasters will be cascading events, and I do so because we live in networked societies and we are increasingly dependent on those networks. So my research group and my colleagues have been busy trying to develop theory and methodology for studying cascades and particularly the interaction of different kinds of vulnerability that will give us forms of escalation at escalation points. Now, that perhaps is important, and it will certainly impact things like critical infrastructure. Indeed, it might impact many forms of life. What we haven't done, and what might be a very big challenge of the future, is to extend the whole concept of cascades, of chains of events, of interactions, into the reconstruction, the recovery phase, into the preparedness phase. In other words, to give it another dimension, not just the short term, but the long term in, as it were, either direction. So that's something that we would like to see done. One thing that I've been very impressed by is the memorial side, and let's call it in Latin damnatio memoriae. Well, sort of damned memory, if you like, but what it really means is a memory of something rather dark, something rather bad. Except that it isn't quite. What it actually is an interweaving of the negative and the positive, because much of the scope and the intention of the memorial process is to create something positive out of something horrendous and something very negative. There is in that process a tension between those who wish to remember and those who wish to forget. In other countries, what you often find is that those who wish to forget prevail, and the recovery reconstruction process is one of trying to cancel out, often it's a futile exercise, but they do it anyway, trying to cancel out the signs of the disaster, almost to pretend that it had never happened. And that, of course, causes the collective memory to decline even faster than it would naturally. However, I tour around this area, the San Rico coast, and I listen to talks about Banda Aceh, and I find that there is much more of a tendency to want to remember the disaster, to have memorials to it. And what's the point of a memorial? Well, it's a commemoration, it's a form of symbolizing the collective memory. It has a value in education, particularly of those who are perhaps too young to have experienced the event and the future generations. It is a point of reference for those who are affected. It's even a tourist attraction. You might regard that as a little bit bizarre, but if tourists learn, then that surely is a good thing. And finally, it provides a little bit of closure and a little bit of permanence to something that in one way was very transient. It occurred very quickly, but in another way has marked society indelibly. So I think it's very important that there be this sort of memorial, and I much appreciate these attempts to create it and to think profoundly about what a memorial, damnatio memoriae, actually means and what it could do in the service of society. So I do think that's important. On occasion we've talked about community. Now there is in the disasters field a sense that community is almost a magic ingredient. It's something that will solve all sorts of problems. Well, possibly. One problem with it is at what scale does community exist? And that is actually increasingly difficult with the network society and the fact that your community might be you and your colleagues in an entirely different continent rather than the neighbourhood. Here's an illustration of what community means. I live in a part of London, I live in 2 different countries, which is perhaps fortunate under these circumstances, but I live in a part of London that has a very strong sense of community for 5 different reasons. One, it's got a higher than normal murder rate. Secondly, it's a nationally recognised centre for the distribution of illegal drugs. Thirdly, it's had its own terrorist outrage. Fourthly, it was the first part of the city to give street furniture to people sleeping rough. And finally, bedroom furniture, people sleeping rough. And finally, it was a centre for the teaching of jihad until the police finally shot them down. So there you are, you've got a tremendous sense of community there. But is it actually a positive one? Now, of course, you could say, well, so what? It's just one place. But I've actually lived in a number of different places. I lived in a village that was 4,000 years old. It was founded in 1750 BC. And its defining characteristics were boredom and envy. And these led to a situation in which the community function was anything but therapeutic. So my message to you is, yes, community, it can be wonderful, it can be, but you've got to be a little bit careful when you use this concept because of what it might mean. Another factor is culture, and I think we are finally beginning to realise, anthropologists have realised it all along, but if they have a fault, it is that they haven't got this across to those of us who are not anthropologists until very recently. We're beginning to realise the importance of culture because it's a frame of reference and it's the way in which people interpret things, whether it's the official culture of public administrators or top politicians, or the culture of people who live behind a tsunami wall or whatever. Of course, there are a lot of problems with culture. One, again, is the scale. At what scale does culture exist? Well, it's a bit like Chinese boxes or Russian dolls in the sense that you can have culture at all different scales, but how do they fit together, and which is the dominant culture? And do we have culture clashes? And in fact, is culture something that sits rather uneasily with society rather than simply being a nice, neat, defining characteristic? And one of the things that we have been grappling with, I think, is cultural change. Now, cultural change occurs anyway because there's cultural dynamism, and I would say that that is largely fueled by technology these days. The technology itself doesn't create the culture, but Henry Quarantelli, the noted sociologist of disaster, wrote in a paper in 1997 that technology leads a double life. It does what its designers intended it to do, and it also does what they didn't intend it to do. So we're beginning to see that now with social media. When they came upon the scene in 2008, 9, and that sort of period, for the first few years there was unbounded optimism about social media. What we now find is that each day that passes reveals yet more of the dark side of social media, and how in fact they may well be used to corrupt or subvert society. And this brings me on to something that I think is very important that we do, and that is that we look fairly and squarely at the dark side of disasters. Now, there are assumptions that we make about human motivation, but unfortunately not all human motivation is actually good. There is corruption, there is exploitation, there is opportunism, discrimination in the dynamism of politics, economics and social change. And we really do have to get to grips with that, I am afraid. It is not easy, especially if the people who are funding you are the people you might wish to criticize, of course. But we live in a society, perhaps it's not so evident in Japan, I don't know about Indonesia, perhaps it isn't very evident there, but in certain other places, in Europe and in Brazil, and above all in the United States, I think we see anomie, which is a word coined by Émile Durkheim, the French economist, sociologist, philosopher, whatever he was, all three probably. Anomie is a form of nihilism, where in fact negative sentiments prevail and they affect the way that we do things. And that is something we're going to have to worry about very much. We're into an age of identity politics worldwide, and identity politics tend to be exclusive rather than inclusive. What we know about disaster risk reduction is that it is a social process and a socializing process. And unless we socialize it, it won't work. So in fact, we have to go rather against the grain regarding the world pattern. So in fact, if those things are not happening in these two countries, then they should be held up as models of how things ought to be done. And if they are happening, then we have to confront them and be honest about it as much as we possibly can. So a culture of safety and a culture of prudence is another thread that runs through all of this and that we wish. And we've talked about the decline of collective memory. And that, I think, is an enduring theme. And it's something that I think we all wish to combat. We do it by creating tsunami museums and education centres, oral histories, documentation centres, and so on. But it's going to be quite an uphill process. Can you change culture? Can you do a sort of cultural engineering? Well, I think, yes, you can, except that if you do that, it is a slow process. Indeed, it's an excruciatingly slow process, and it is a resource-intensive and a labour-intensive process. In other words, you have to keep getting the message across ad nauseum before it really works. But it can have effects, and it can positively change society to be more prudent and more conscious of the need for safety. I note in travelling around the San Rico area that there is a renewed interest in disability and disaster. This is very, very important. Although, as I understand it, in Japan, only about 3% of the population are registered as disabled, the actual percentage will be, going by world averages, something like 16%. So something like 1 in 7 or 8 of the population is disabled, and that includes some but not all elderly people. Now that is a very large minority to deal with, and a large minority to deprive of their human rights and their safety and everything else. So it is actually imperative that they be fully included in the disaster risk reduction process. The problem with it is that people with disabilities, there's a vast range of possible disabilities, conditions and severities, and they require personal, individual disaster plans, whereas most planning and preparedness is collective, it doesn't do the individual. However, what we find from experience is that this is not impossible. It means getting the protagonists around the table. The first protagonists are those of the people with disabilities who can articulate their needs and be their own protagonists. If not, then their carers and their representatives, the social services, the health services, the civil protection services, and work out the solutions. And with the right will and the right effort and some resources, it most certainly can be done. We have the models for it. So that is a challenge that I can see it being tackled finally here. I was very sceptical about that 5 years ago, but I see some really good new developments on it. The other one is gender and disaster. We have a centre for the study of that in my university, very important. There was an extremely critical report of the aftermath, the immediate aftermath of the tsunami, that women's concerns were not being properly addressed, and that decisions were being made largely by elderly men, most of them in Tokyo apparently. And so we hope then that also will be something that will rise to the top of the agenda and stay there, because it is very important, not merely because there's slightly more than half of the population. And if we're talking about democracy, then that has a fairly obvious reach to it. So, of course, my final point is more research is required. Of course it is, otherwise I'd be out of a job. Thanks for listening.